Hey, what is up guys, it's TotalWarKS here. In today's video, I'll be going through some of my personal favorite weapon loadouts in Mount&Blade 2 Bannerlord. So, let's jump right in. Starting off at number 5 will be what I call the Frontline Loadout. This loadout will primarily be used in sieges or fighting alongside our own infantry units on foot in an open battle. This will consist of a one-handed weapon, a shield, a spear, and javelins. I personally prefer a mace against heavily armored opponents, but we can really go with whichever one we prefer. A one-handed saber is not too bad either. Obviously, the shield will be there to protect us from any missiles, as well as giving us a way easier time when we are up against multiple opponents. This is why having a shield is quite important here, especially when we fight on foot at the very front of our army. The javelins can be used right before we engage in melee to whittle down our enemies. The spear will be important to have, especially when we are up against a faction like Vlandia, who will have tons of cavalry units in open battle. This can be a very fun loadout overall to go with, especially if we enjoy role-playing as an infantryman right in the thick of the fight at the very front of it all, which is why I call this the Frontline Loadout. Coming in at number 2, the classic range loadout, which I'm pretty sure most of us have tried at least once. It will consist of either a bow or crossbow, 2 slots of ammo, and if we're on foot, I'd recommend a two-handed weapon. On horseback, I'd recommend a polearm like the glaive. I personally only use bows or crossbows that has no horseback restrictions, so I do not need to switch back and forth in between sieges and open battles. But if we are somebody who actually prefer being on foot, then something like the noble longbow or the bound crossbow should be used. This weapon loadout will allow us to pump out tons of DPS, kill a bunch of enemies from a safe distance with a very low risk of dying until we run out of ammunition, or if the enemy closes in to the point where we have no choice but to engage in melee combat, which is when we will switch to our two-handed or polearm weaponry, and can still be quite effective. This loadout is particularly useful for sieges, as we'll often struggle to get straight into the fight and have minimal impact. With this, we can have a bigger impact during a siege. A great loadout overall if we want to roleplay as either a Crusade horse archer, a Battanian foot archer, or a Vlandian crossbowman, and for anybody who simply enjoys having this long-range option to dispatch enemies from afar. Coming in at number 3, the Melee Cav Loadout, one that is designed for those who wants to get in and out of a fight swiftly without being tied down during a battle. It consists of a lance, shield, a one-handed weapon, and a swing type polearm like a long glaive. The lance and shield is an obvious choice, as it will allow us to couch lance to start off the battle, pretty much giving us a guaranteed kill 99% of the time, regardless of how heavily armored our opponents are. For the second polearm, I personally like using a glaive and a long glaive to switch it up a little bit whenever we want to engage in melee while still on horseback without the need to dash back and forth in order to get our couch lance off. And it is a pretty straightforward and overpowering weapon, like most of the swing type polearms. The one-handed weapon is there in case we ever get dismounted, which means the lance is going to be pretty much useless, and the glaive can still be good, but if the enemies are right in our faces, then it is better to have a shorter weapon, like any of the one-handed weaponry. And then the shield is going to be there to give us that extra bit of protection to block missiles, as well as block enemy attacks. This loadout can also be used to roleplay as a knight if we get rid of that glaive and chuck in another one-handed weapon, having a sword and a mace, so we can switch if we want to capture our enemies by knocking them unconscious instead of killing them. This is great for anybody who enjoys horseback combat. Couch lancing back and forth still can get into the thick of the fight without much issues. Coming in at number 2, the Sledgehammer Loadout. I think this is one of the weapons that people do not use as often, and the weapon itself is actually fairly cheap. So the loadout consists of the obviously Sledgehammer itself as our primary weapon, a shield, and then really we can mix it up with anything else we want. I personally like it with 2 javelins to fill up the slots. Talking about the Sledgehammer itself, I believe it is the only weapon that has the knockdown effect. So when we connect a hit on an enemy, there is a chance they will be knocked onto the ground, rendering them disabled for a brief moment as they get back up on their feet. This can also be used to dismount cavalry units, making it easy to finish them off. This weapon is fairly effective both on horseback and on foot, though I do prefer it more on foot. Similar to some other two-handed heavy weaponry, each swing can go through our opponent, meaning we can hit 2 enemies at once. So this is going to help especially when we are outnumbered, increasing our damage output. Because it is a hammer, it will do blunt damage, so that will be quite effective against heavily armored opponents as well. And if we want to increase the amount of prisoners we capture, since the enemies will not die from our attacks. they will only be knocked unconscious. The shield will be there to protect us as we slowly gap close towards our enemies without being shot in the face, and once we're close enough we can take out our sledgehammer. The javelins will be used to whittle down our opponents right before we engage in melee. Finally, this weapon can also be used in civilian settings, so if you're doing a rival gang quest, this weapon can come in handy. Overall, this loadout can be quite fun for those who enjoy the two-handed heavy weaponry combat style. Finally, coming in at number 1, the Heavy Executioner Loadout. Like the name suggests, our primary weapon will be the Heavy Executioner Axe, which is by far one of the strongest two-handed weapons out there, with crazy high damage that can destroy our enemies regardless of how much armor they have. For the rest of the loadout, it's going to be pretty similar as the previous one. We can really go with anything we want. I like to go with a shield just so I can close in onto the enemies without the risk of being hit in the face by an arrow or javelin, then whip out the axe once we're in melee range. Once again, the javelin's going to be there to start off an engagement with the enemies right before we close into melee range. I personally like to play this on foot as it feels way more fun and satisfying chopping our way through the enemy infantry line compared to on horseback, which a swinging polearm is probably preferred. The Heavy Executioner Axe also has the ability to cut through an opponent, allowing us to hit 2 enemies at once. Overall, this loadout can be extremely fun for those who enjoys a two-handed heavy infantry style of gameplay, where we are fighting the enemies face to face on foot, as well as anyone who may want to roleplay as a Assyri elite heavy infantryman. So that's it for my 5 personal favorite weapon loadouts to try in Bannerlord. Have you tried out any of these weapon loadouts before? And which one is your favorite? And if you found the video helpful, make sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe for more future Bannerlord content. As always, thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.